Tonight, we're talking about Sydney. Because what happened at Bondi Beach on Sunday, December 14th, 2025, was not just a local tragedy. It instantly became a global story about terrorism, anti-Semitism, radicalisation, gun licensing failures, and how fast misinformation can set communities on fire. Bondi Beach is supposed to be a symbol of Australia. Open air, families, surfers, tourists, people eating and laughing as the sun drops. And that evening, hundreds of people were there for a public community event marking the start of Hanukkah, often described as Hanukkah by the sea. According to Australian authorities and major reporting, 2 gunmen opened fire and turned an iconic public space into a massacre. 15 people were killed, and around 40 were injured, including children and police officers. The total death toll rose to 16 because one of the attackers was killed at the scene. Let's be precise about what we know and what we do not know, because in the first 24 hours after an attack like this, bad information spreads faster than facts. What happened? Reporting from Reuters and the Associated Press describes the shooting as lasting roughly 10 to 20 minutes, with panicked crowds running across the sand, into nearby streets, and seeking cover wherever they could. Police responded, and the older attacker was shot dead. The younger attacker was wounded and taken to hospital in critical condition. Australia is a country with strict gun laws compared to many places, so the shock was national. Reuters called it the deadliest mass shooting in Australia in almost 30 years, and noted the government immediately began discussing tightening licensing and building a national firearms register. Who were the attackers? Police have not officially released the suspects' names, but multiple major outlets, including Australia's national broadcaster ABC, as cited by Reuters, identified them as a father and son, Sajid Akram, CR 50, and Naveed Akram, 24. Here is what else is publicly reported. The older man allegedly held a firearms license since 2015, and police said there were 6 registered weapons connected to him. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said the younger man had been examined by security services in 2019 in relation to associations that raised concern, but at the time authorities assessed there was no indication of an ongoing threat. Officials have said there was no evidence they were part of a broader cell, even while the act is being treated as terrorism. Reuters also reported that 2 Islamic State flags were found in the vehicle, citing ABC reporting. But note carefully, that detail is still part of an ongoing investigation and may be clarified further by police. Who were the victims? This part matters. When people argue online, they often talk about groups. But what was lost here were human beings, and the names we know should be said out loud. The Guardian and Reuters reported the victims ranged from 10 to 87 years old, and that not all victims had been formally identified publicly at the time of reporting. Victims publicly named in major reporting include Matilda Rabbi Eli Schlanger, Alexander, Alex, Clayton, Peter Meager, Dan Elkayam, Reuben, Morrison, Yakov, Levitan, Marika Pagani. Authorities and outlets also reported that some victims' names were not yet released publicly, either due to formal identification processes or family wishes. The hero the internet must not ignore. In the middle of this, a bystander did something almost unthinkable. Ahmed al-Ahmed tackled and disarmed one of the gunmen and was badly wounded. Reuters reported fundraising for him surged, and ABC interviewed his family as he awaited surgeries. This detail matters for one reason. It destroys the lazy, dangerous narrative that tries to turn this into Muslims versus Jews. The target here was a Jewish community event, an anti-Semitic act of terrorism by all credible reporting. But one of the people who saved lives was a man from a Muslim background who is being widely praised as a hero. Motive and reason. What can be said responsibly, Prime Minister Albanese called the attack an act of anti-Semitism and an act of terrorism. But even when motive seems clear, the reason is often layered. Ideology and hate, personal networks pathways to radicalization, access to weapons security blind spots, and triggering global events that extremists exploit. That's why officials have stressed both the ideological element and the fact that investigators are still working through what exactly happened behind the scenes. The gun licensing question How does this happen in Australia? One of the biggest political shocks is that the weapons were reportedly legally held under license. That is now pushing Australia toward a debate on tighter rules on how many weapons a license can cover, how long licenses last, not in perpetuity, whether there should be stronger ongoing checks as people's circumstances change, a national firearms register. This is a crucial point. Immigration policy is not the same thing as firearms licensing policy. Even if a country debates borders, the immediate operational failure here, based on current reporting, also includes weapon access and the ability for radicalisation to develop over time while legal permissions stay in place. Immigration problems. What's real and what's propaganda? Now, you ask directly about immigration, and it's important to be careful here. A common pattern after terrorism is that people jump to immigration as the single explanation. But Reuters and the AP reporting on this case points to something more specific: a father with a gun license, a younger man previously scrutinized by security services, and an attack carried out in a public place. Immigration debates may become politically central after this attack, especially around vetting, citizenship rules tied to firearms permits, and monitoring of extremist pathways. In fact, Reuters reported proposals under consideration included restricting certain permits to Australian citizens. But here's the line you should not cross in your video: blaming whole immigrant communities for the actions of individuals. That's not analysis. That's collective punishment, and it creates the next wave of violence. Why is it Muslims attacking, but other events involve Jews? This is where we have to be blunt. That framing is exactly how social media turns tragedy into a culture war. Here are the facts that break the trap. In this Sydney case, the target was a Jewish Hanukkah event, and the political reaction has centered on antisemitic terrorism. The identity of attackers in other major events varies widely by country, ideology, mental health, and access to weapons. You cannot honestly explain global violence with a single group label. Sydney itself is proof. In April 2024, the Bondi Junction mass stabbing that killed 6 was carried out by Joel Cauchi, and police said it was not an ideological attack. Reuters reported it was linked to mental health issues, and there was no evidence of ideology as a motive. Even in cases where ideology exists, it still does not justify treating Muslims as a monolith. That's not only wrong, it's strategically stupid, because it hands extremists exactly what they want: polarization, backlash, recruitment fuel. So if you want a real answer, extremists come in different forms: jihadist extremists, far-right extremists, and others. And when any society starts treating ordinary civilians as enemies because of religion or ethnicity, it becomes easier for extremists on all sides to grow. What to say in your video without getting trapped by hate bait? If your channel is for people who want to understand what's happening worldwide, focus your story on the real pillars: Bondi Beach shooting, Sydney terror attack, Hanukkah event targeted, anti-Semitic violence, radicalisation, ASIO scrutiny, gun licensing loopholes, National Firearms Register, hate crime risk, community protection is social cohesion. And then ask the questions that matter. How did legally held firearms end up used in a mass casualty attack? What does known to authorities actually mean? And where did the system fail or succeed before this point? How do we stop anti-Semitic attacks without triggering retaliatory hate against Muslims or immigrants? How do governments disrupt extremist pathways before violence without turning into surveillance states? Because the moment you turn this into Muslims versus Jews, you stop informing your audience, and you start feeding the same machine that produced the violence. Sydney is grieving. Families are burying a child. A community event meant to bring light ended in bloodshed. And in the background, the political system is scrambling to tighten gun laws, to answer questions about security assessments, and to stop the next act of hate before it happens. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: the truth is more powerful than the rage. And the truth here is clear. The victims were targeted for being Jewish. The country is now confronting hard questions about weapons access and extremist ideology. And the next phase, what happens in the streets and online, will determine whether this tragedy becomes a turning point or the beginning of something worse.